Hi there, everyone. My name is Prerak Juthani. I'm an MD MBA, and I'm a first-year resident at Stanford in internal medicine. And if there's one thing I know as a resident, it's the fact that residency interviews are starting up, and actually we at Stanford have our first interviews for incoming interns happening this upcoming week. So I want to create this small presentation to help anyone prepping for interviews. It's not just for internal medicine, because the process that I'm going to show you is going to go over 3 big steps and ultimately show you how to stay organized and get, hopefully, the residency of your dreams. So I'm going to talk about 3 things, as I said. I'm going to overview the process. Where are we in the process of applying to residency? Because it is a year-long process. Then the second thing I'm going to do is tell you about how to stay organized during this process, because there's a lot of information, and especially because a lot of interviews are still going to be virtual, there are a lot of things that you can do to optimize your chances. And the third thing is actually understanding the workflow of things and seeing how all of the information you're getting from programs can be thoroughly organized to help you reach the decision of where you want to ultimately go. So with that being said, let's start with the first step, which is understanding what is the process. The interviews start sending out their invitations around October, and most people have gotten some invitations at this point. However, most programs may still continue trickling out invitations for the rest of the season, but many of them do go out in October. And then from October, November, December, and January, I can tell you that those are the prime interview months. I think my last interview was around late January, if not maybe February. And you'll be doing interviews between basically end of October to early January/February. I want to show you this very interesting graph that I'm going to include in the comment section below. And this actually shows you the percent of programs interviews during each time period. So you can see that this is invitations that are extended. This isn't the actual formal interview itself. It's the invitation to interview. And I'll definitely give the asterisk that this is from 2017, but I can tell you that from one year to the next, very few things tend to change. So I still think this is a pretty decent insight into when programs interviews are sent out. I think this is particularly for emergency medicine, but it's still, I think, particularly relevant because, as I said, interview invites are usually relatively agnostic in terms of when they're sent out, except for the specialties that tend to have an early match, which include urology and ophthalmology. Aside from that, most interviews are around the same interview season. You can see that percent of programs interviews conducted during each time period, and you can see that that's when November and December and January peak. November is the plurality, and you can see that most of the interview invites go out in October, and that's exactly where we're at, which is why if you haven't gotten any interviews yet, you haven't had a formal interview, that makes sense because most interviews will be happening from November through January, and most of the invites are going out in October, which is where we're at. So again, it's always good to have data, and that's exactly where we started, and this is exactly where we are in the season currently. Now for some additional data. This is directly from the NRMP, which is the National Residency Matching Program, the people who actually run the algorithm. And I'm going to include this in the discussion below as well. This is actually the most updated, and I think it's taken from 2022, and so you can find this attached. But why do interviews matter so much? The interviews matter because the more programs that you interview at, the more places that you can rank on your rank list. The more, if you interview at 30 places, you can rank all 30 of those places when it comes to match day. And why is the number of places that you rank so important? Well, because it's almost virtually shown that if you rank more than 20 places, you are guaranteed to match. Notice that the probability of matching is on the y-axis and the number of places that you put on your rank list is on the x-axis. This is across all specialties, and of course, this isn't always true because some specialties you can rank a ton of places and still not match if it's very, very competitive. But for the most part, if you rank more places, the algorithm is such that it'll just start pairing you up with the place that is the highest for you that also wanted you, right? And so you can see that almost every year, you can even see in 2022, there were 80% of people who applied matched. And you can see that the people who matched had 13 places on their rank list. The people who didn't match, which was the remaining 20%, only had 4 places on their rank list, right? Which means usually they either only got 4 interviews or they only decided to put down 4 places. The fewer places that you place on your rank list, the lower your probability of matching, purely from a statistical standpoint, right? If you list 80 places and you interviewed at 80 places, chances are that at least one of them will rank you somewhere and you'll be matched up. But if you only interviewed at one place, it's a very, very tough shot to say that you will definitely get that place, because that place is interviewing hundreds, if not thousands of people. So all that to say, it can be really tough. And I know interviews are very stressful, but this is actually why getting interviews is very important and such an integral part of the matching process. The more interviews you have, the more places you can put on your rank list. More places you put on your rank list, increase chances of matching. So now let's actually talk about how to stay organized during this entire interview process, because you can see that while you're applying, you're going to have your ERAS application, you're going to have your supplemental application, you're going to have things that you wrote for your hobbies, you're going to have things that you wrote for your interest and your personal statement. So when I was applying, before I got interviews, I had all of this stuff organized on my Google Drive. And then once I got interviews, I also created a separate tab for interviews. And in each of those tabs, I actually wrote down the place where I interviewed, and I would keep notes about that institution and the people that I interviewed with. So you can see that once I actually got interviews, I created a long list and the date that I got those interviews. And I actually wrote the institution's name next to those interviews. So again, you're looking at my residency folder, you're looking in my applying, and now you're in my interviews section. And you can see that in the interviews, I actually had places that I interviewed. And you can see that I interviewed at Stanford, which ended up being my top choice, but it was my very early November as well, actually the first time I interviewed. And in that Stanford folder, I actually kept very detailed notes about all the things that they sent us. They sent us an application brochure, they sent us a newsletter, and then when I actually interviewed at Stanford, I kept a running document of the notes during the interview that I took. Because the interview is not just them interviewing you, you are also interviewing them. They tell you about their program. They tell you about the research opportunities. They tell you about the clinical activities. They tell you about what your schedule might look like. They tell you about call days. They tell you about wellness, right? They tell you about everything that they have to offer. And if you don't take notes during that time, it's going to be so easy for everything to mesh together that it's going to essentially seem like, oh, this is exactly the same program as before. And so that's why when you actually go and do these interviews, I recommend you keep this mechanism of tracking things, because every institution, I guarantee you, will send you a ton of stuff. And when they send you that stuff, you want to have a place to keep it. So when you're actually making your rank list in January and February and March, you actually have stuff to reference, because trust me, these interviews will start meshing together. And you might be wondering, hey, Prerak, what kind of notes did you take in this Stanford interview? What is the template that you followed? And you actually see that I kept the template about the same. So I before I started, I included all the documents relevant to the program. I then included their social media handles, because if they have an Instagram or something like that, you're usually publishing things about what's going on in the residency. I had the schedule for the actual interview, which they will send you. Then I have about the program, which they send you, core values. They tell you a bit about the curriculum as well as pathways, and maybe even the hospitals that they rotate at. And so because I had this very overarching template, it allowed me to understand every program in a very systematic way, which I strongly encourage everyone to do, because it's going to be very easy for you to think all programs sound the same, which is not necessarily true. And also, when you're creating this template, there are some important questions that you should be asking yourself as a future doctor in whatever specialty you're doing. So specifically, you might want to be doing orthopedic surgery. Orthopedic surgery has fellowships. You want to know how many people at this research at the institution you're interviewing at, how many people do fellowships, especially if you're interested in fellowship. What if you're interested in a spine fellowship and no one from this program has done a spine fellowship in years, right? So these are all questions and things to have jotted down. You might also want to think about, why is this program unique? Why is this location unique? And perhaps the most important thing that you want to write down in your notes is, who do you have your interviews with, and who are those individuals? Because they are going to be your entry to the program, right? They are going to be the ones who are going to be telling you about the program. So you want to know them, you want to know their hobbies, you want to know how they've liked it there. And so when you write down the interviewers' names, which you will get either the day of or the day prior to the interview, you should definitely look the interviewers up and get to know them a bit, so that way you have good questions to ask them. And then the last part of this, which is also important, is questions that you have about the program. Anytime people are going over the program during interviews, or if you're talking to students, write down any questions you have and ask them either during your interview, throughout the interview day, or even directly to any part of the program during interview day. And lastly, If you're in the interview and you realize you may not have as deep of an insight as you want, you can always ask anyone, hey, is there anyone I can talk to about your research? Is there anyone I can talk to about whether or not you all focus on venture capital, digital health, entrepreneurship? And they'll give you some names. Write those names down and make sure you reach out to them after the interview. This will make sure that you get the biggest bang for your buck from the interview, because this might be the only time you get a chance to sit down with the program. And especially in a virtual world, you want to make the most of it. And lastly, I want to end with some questions that you 100% should be ready to answer. And in the future, I'm happy to tell you a systematic approach to these questions. But these questions will 100% be asked. And I kind of went through each of my notes that I took. And I actually wrote down questions that I was asked at every interview, and especially questions that surprised me. And so questions to be ready for is why program X? Why specialty X? So why internal medicine? Why orthopedic surgery? Why vascular surgery? Why do you want to come to Stanford? What about Stanford interests you? What makes you diverse? What makes you a unique candidate that would be different from someone else? What do you specifically care about? And how do you see yourself fitting into the program and contributing to the program? And how can the program help you in your career goals? And then the last two are going to be usually hypothetical questions. So sometimes they'll say, can you tell me about your research in this? And other times they'll say, hey, tell me a time that you failed, or tell me a time when you had to, remediate a conflict or something like that. These hypothetical questions come up quite a bit, and you should be ready for them. So I hope this all gave you a systematic approach to the residency interview. If it did, please drop a like, comment, subscribe, and share with a friend. I duly appreciate it. Thank you all so much for watching. I have a night shift to get to, but I hope to see some of you maybe at Stanford next year. It's an incredible place, and I'm loving it. It's really hard. Residency in general is really hard, but we'll make the most of it. So thanks all for watching, and peace.